January 1945. Somewhere along the frozen roads of Western Europe. Snow clings to torn hedgerows and shattered fence posts. The air is still, heavy with cordite and exhaustion. A small group of German soldiers stands clustered beside the road, helmets off, weapons gone, hands stiff from cold and surrender. They are prisoners now. Veterans, many of them, men who have marched across Europe and survived years of war. In front of them stands an Allied sergeant. He looks impossibly young. His uniform hangs loose on narrow shoulders. His rank insignia is clean, almost new. When he speaks, his voice is calm, measured, without anger. The Germans exchange glances. A few allow themselves a faint smile. This is who commands them now, a boy, barely old enough to shave. They do not laugh out loud. They do not need to. Experience has taught them what authority usually looks like, and this does not fit the image. What they cannot see, what none of them yet understand, is that the war has changed faster than they have, that youth no longer means inexperience, and that the orders this young sergeant is about to give will reach far beyond this quiet road, unraveling a defense his captives still believe is intact. The moment hangs, suspended, waiting for the world that created it to come into focus. By the winter of 1944-1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, grinding phase. Germany was no longer advancing. It was enduring. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944 had shattered the myth of an impenetrable Atlantic wall. Within weeks, German formations in France were bleeding men and machines faster than they could be replaced. The breakout from Normandy, followed by the encirclement at Falaise in August, destroyed entire divisions. Vehicles were abandoned by the roadside. Artillery was left without horses or fuel. Command structures fractured under constant air attack. Yet the German army did not collapse outright. It pulled back, step by step, fighting delaying actions across France and Belgium. Bridges were blown. Towns were contested street by street. For every kilometer lost, German commanders demanded time to regroup, to rebuild defensive lines, to hope for a reversal that no longer had a clear path to reality. On the Allied side, the advance created a different kind of problem. Victory brought distance. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers from the beaches of Normandy. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to move forward through roads never designed for modern mechanized war. American, British, and Commonwealth forces found themselves racing faster than their logistics could sustain. This imbalance shaped the winter campaigns. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden attempted to end the war quickly by seizing bridges deep inside the Netherlands. It failed, not because of a lack of bravery, but because German resistance, though weakened, still knew how to defend when given time and terrain. By December, the Western Front hardened. Mud replaced dust. Snow replaced mud. The fighting slowed into a series of bitter engagements fought in forests, villages, and frozen fields. Germany's final major counteroffensive came in mid-December, the Ardennes Offensive. Known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, it was a desperate gamble. Panzer divisions were thrown forward with barely trained infantry, relying on surprise and winter weather to neutralize Allied air power. For a moment, it worked. American units were pushed back. Roads became clogged with refugees and retreating columns. Confusion reigned in places like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Houffalize. But the German advance lacked fuel, reserves, and air cover. Once the skies cleared, Allied aircraft returned in overwhelming numbers. By January 1945, the bulge had been flattened. What remained of the German army in the West was exhausted, understrength, and increasingly manned by the very young and the very old. Veteran NCOs were dead or missing. Junior officers were promoted rapidly, sometimes after only weeks of training. Commanders who once planned sweeping maneuvers now focused on holding river lines and crossroads for as long as possible. The Allies, meanwhile, were learning a different lesson. Speed mattered, initiative mattered, and so did trust in small unit leaders. Casualties among experienced officers had forced Allied armies to rely heavily on sergeants, young men given authority not because of age, but because of necessity. These non-commissioned officers led patrols, handled prisoners, coordinated artillery fire, and made decisions that could shift an entire local battle. By early 1945, it was no longer unusual for a platoon or even a company to be commanded by someone barely in their 20s. This reality unsettled German prisoners. For years, they had been taught to respect rank, age, and visible authority. A youthful Allied sergeant did not fit the old order. To them, he looked like a symptom of Allied overconfidence or desperation. They did not yet realize he was a product of something else entirely, a system that had learned how to adapt faster than theirs. And that difference, quiet, structural, and invisible, was about to reveal itself on a frozen stretch of road where the war, for a moment, narrowed to a handful of men and a single set of orders.
The sector where this moment unfolds is not marked by fame. It is not a named battle remembered in bold letters on maps. It is a stretch of contested ground typical of early 1945. Secondary roads, small villages, wooded ridge lines, and shallow river lines that mattered only because armies were moving through them. After the collapse of the Ardennes offensive, German commanders reverted to doctrine they understood well: elastic defense. Units were ordered to delay, withdraw, and delay again. Hold long enough to disrupt Allied timetables, destroy bridges, force the enemy to deploy, then pull back before being encircled. On paper, the plan was sound. In reality, it depended on coordination Germany no longer possessed. Communications were unreliable. Field telephones were cut by artillery. Radios were scarce or jammed. Units often had no clear picture of where neighboring formations stood. Orders arrived late or not at all. Defensive positions were sometimes occupied by remnants of different units thrown together with no shared command history. Still, German soldiers continued to trust their defenses. They trusted prepared positions dug into forest edges. They trusted pre-registered artillery zones. They trusted that Allied advances, however powerful, still had to respect terrain, weather, and supply limitations. Most of all, they trusted time. If they could delay long enough, perhaps the war would end on negotiated terms. Perhaps political fractures among the Allies would appear. Perhaps new weapons, promised endlessly by propaganda, would shift the balance. This belief sustained discipline even in captivity. German POWs taken prisoner in early 1945 were often calm. They had surrendered locally, but many assumed their broader defensive system remained intact. Captivity was seen as temporary, a pause, an inconvenience. Handling prisoners, meanwhile, had become routine for Allied units. Thousands were captured daily as German formations disintegrated into pockets. Standard procedure was clear: disarm, search, assemble, and move them to the rear as soon as possible. Guards were assigned. Routes were chosen carefully to avoid artillery fire and counterattacks. These tasks often fell to sergeants, young men who, only months earlier, had been privates. They had learned quickly. They had to. Mistakes cost lives. Hesitation invited disaster.
By this stage of the war, Allied doctrine emphasized initiative at the lowest level. If a sergeant saw an opportunity or a threat, he was expected to act without waiting for permission. Higher command trusted that judgment because there was no alternative. German doctrine, by contrast, remained centralized. Orders flowed downward. Initiative outside assigned boundaries was discouraged. Even experienced NCOs were conditioned to wait for instruction, especially when dealing with prisoners or withdrawals. This difference was subtle but decisive. It shaped perception. When German POWs looked at a young Allied sergeant, they saw someone executing routine tasks. They did not see a decision-maker. They did not imagine that this individual could influence anything beyond the narrow road in front of him. They were wrong. Unbeknownst to them, Allied units were probing deeper than German commanders realized. Reconnaissance patrols had identified weak points. Artillery observers were already positioned. Timetables were tightening. What appeared to be a stable defensive line was in truth a series of disconnected strongpoints barely aware of one another. The prisoners stood within a collapsing structure and did not yet feel it. The young sergeant did. He had information they did not. Fragmentary reports, map coordinates marked hastily in pencil, radio messages that hinted, not explicitly but clearly, that speed now mattered more than caution. What followed would not be dramatic in the way battles are often imagined. There would be no speeches, no heroic charges, only orders, quietly given, precisely timed, that would transform prisoners into unwitting witnesses of their own system's failure. And as those orders began to take shape, the assumptions carried by both sides were about to collide. The German prisoners are tired. Their uniforms tell the story before their faces do. Mud ground into wool, boots worn thin at the heels. Some wear pieces of different units, an artillery greatcoat over infantry trousers, a helmet marked by a unit that no longer exists. These are not the soldiers of 1939 or 1941. They are survivors of attrition. Many have fought for years: Poland, France, Russia, Italy, now the West again. They have learned when to resist and when resistance no longer serves a purpose. Surrender for them is not shame, it is arithmetic. They watch the young sergeant with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. He is polite, efficient. He does not shout. That alone sets him apart from officers they have known. Some mistake this calm for uncertainty, others for softness. They are wrong on both counts. The sergeant's authority does not come from age or personality. It comes from structure. By 1945, Allied armies had learned how to compress experience. Training emphasized repetition under stress, live fire exercises, after-action reviews. Junior leaders were taught not only how to fight, but how to think in fragments, how to make decisions with incomplete information and accept consequences. This sergeant has likely led patrols at night. He has likely called for fire while under shelling. He has learned that delay can be more dangerous than error. His calm is not youth, it is adaptation. For the German POWs, the sight is unsettling only because it contradicts expectation. They have been taught that authority looks rigid, that command must be visible. A young sergeant contradicts the hierarchy they understand. They assume he is executing orders written elsewhere by someone older, someone unseen. They smile because it reassures them. If this is the face of Allied control, then perhaps the system behind it is equally fragile. They do not realize that the system is working exactly as designed. And as this misjudgment settles in, the space between perception and reality begins to widen, quietly, irreversibly, toward consequences none of them yet imagine. The ground matters more than the men standing on it. A narrow road cuts between shallow rises. Woods press in close on both sides, limiting visibility and funneling movement. To a trained eye, it is a corridor, useful for control, dangerous for retreat. German defensive doctrine would normally anchor such terrain with overlapping fire and fallback positions. But doctrine assumes cohesion. Here, cohesion is gone. What remains are isolated units holding map references that no longer align with reality, strong points that believe they are covered by neighbors who have already withdrawn or been destroyed. The prisoners removed from the line still imagine these defenses intact. The sergeant does not. Behind him, unseen by the prisoners, the Allied war machine is awake. Artillery batteries stand registered and waiting. Radios crackle with clipped confirmations. Supply columns, delayed for months by distance, are finally catching up. Fuel and ammunition are no longer scarce at the point of contact. This is the difference between pressure and inevitability. German defenses still assume scarcity on the other side. They assume hesitation. They assume that every Allied move requires approval from above. None of that is true anymore.
War teaches men to categorize. Enemy, prisoner, guard, officer, veteran, boy. These categories create comfort. They simplify fear. For the Germans, smiling at the young sergeant is a way of reclaiming dignity, a reminder that, despite defeat, they still understand how the world works. But war also punishes certainty. The moral weight carried by the sergeant is invisible. He knows that decisions made here, small ones, spoken quietly, will shape what happens to men he will never see. He knows that restraint and aggression are no longer opposites, but tools to be applied in sequence. He gives no sign of this knowledge, because the men in front of him are watching. And as the final assumptions harden on both sides, the moment approaches when orders will replace expectation and reveal how completely the balance has shifted. The orders are given without ceremony. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, just short instructions delivered in a tone meant to carry over wind and distance. The young sergeant turns slightly, angling his body away from the prisoners, careful not to invite attention. His hand gestures are minimal, efficient. A runner moves first. Then a radio call, brief, coded, acknowledged immediately. The German prisoners notice none of it. They are focused on smaller things, the cold, the weight of standing still, the possibility of cigarettes later. A few continue to watch the sergeant with mild curiosity, unaware that the situation has already moved beyond them. What the sergeant has done is simple, but precise. He has identified a gap, not a weakness in men, but in timing. German doctrine assumes that prisoner movement is slow, cautious, rearward focused. It assumes Allied units handling POWs are temporarily fixed, distracted, defensive. That assumption has shaped how nearby German units have positioned themselves. Instead of halting the advance to process prisoners, he redirects momentum. He orders his platoon forward on a parallel route, using the prisoner's capture as cover for movement rather than a pause. At the same time, he relays coordinates that confirm something higher command suspected but had not verified. The German line here is hollow. Artillery is not yet fired. That is deliberate. Silence preserves uncertainty. Forward elements advance under the assumption that the enemy still believes time exists. It does not. Within minutes, Allied squads begin to appear where German sentries do not expect them, on flanks believed secure, at junctions thought unreachable without preparation. Defensive fire plans, meticulously plotted weeks earlier, no longer align with reality on the ground. Some German units attempt to adjust. Orders are requested, clarification is sought,
Radios crackle with overlapping voices, but Central Command, already overloaded, responds too slowly. The elastic defense bends, but finds nothing solid to bend back toward. The prisoners sense a change before they understand it. The road grows louder, distant engines, movement that does not follow the rhythm of routine handling. One of the older German NCOs frowns, listening, not to words, but to the shape of sound. Something is happening. The young sergeant does not look back, because what has begun cannot be recalled, and as Allied elements push deeper into space the Germans still believe they control, the first threads of an entire defensive sector begin to unravel, quietly, invisibly, and far faster than anyone on the captured side imagines. The realization comes in fragments, a burst of gunfire where none was expected, a runner arriving out of breath, carrying news already outdated, a field telephone ringing unanswered. German positions that had been instructed to hold now find Allied infantry appearing not from the front, but from angles never accounted for in their plans. This is how defenses collapse, not with a single blow, but with the loss of coherence. The young sergeant's orders have done one critical thing. They have accelerated the tempo beyond German command's ability to respond. Units that rely on synchronization now act independently. Artillery fire arrives late, falling on empty ground. Reserve elements move toward threats that no longer exist. Within hours, the road the prisoners once stood beside is no longer rear area, it is forward ground. German officers attempt to restore control. Some succeed locally, but without reliable communications, each success is isolated, each delay compounds the next failure. For the prisoners, the shift is unmistakable now. They hear sustained fire to the rear. They see Allied vehicles moving in directions that make no sense unless the line behind them has already broken. The smiles fade, conversations stop. One man asks a question no one answers. The sergeant finally looks at them again, not with triumph, not with contempt, with professional distance. He issues another set of instructions. The prisoners are to be moved, not backward, but laterally, away from a zone that will soon be under fire. This detail matters. It confirms what the Germans have begun to understand too late. The fight is no longer where they thought it was. By nightfall, German defensive positions in the sector are untenable. Withdrawals become routes. Equipment is abandoned not out of panic but necessity. Commanders order pullbacks that cannot be coordinated because the routes are already compromised. Reports written later will describe the collapse in neutral language. Enemy penetrated sector faster than anticipated. Communications disrupted. Flank exposed. None will mention the moment on the road. None will name the young sergeant. But the outcome traces back to his decision to act when doctrine suggested waiting. By the time the prisoners are marched away, the defense they believed in no longer exists, not defeated in a single battle, but broken, quietly, efficiently, by orders given at the exact moment certainty failed. And when the guns finally fall silent in this sector, the war moves one step closer to its conclusion. The morning reports arrive slowly. Paper is scarce. Typewriters are shared. Officers dictate summaries in tired voices, stripping events of emotion and compressing chaos into clean lines of text. What happened in this sector is not described as a disaster, only as a necessary withdrawal that occurred faster than planned. But the numbers tell a different story. German units in the area lose cohesion almost entirely. Dozens more soldiers surrender in the following days, often without firing a shot. Equipment is left behind in working order, machine guns without crews, artillery pieces without towing vehicles, stacks of ammunition abandoned in barns and forest clearings. The ground gained by Allied forces is not dramatic on a map. A few kilometers, several villages, a road network now firmly under control. But the psychological impact is far greater than the territory suggests. For the German army, this is another confirmation of an uncomfortable truth. The front can no longer be stabilized. Each defensive line holds for less time than the last. Each withdrawal creates new gaps. Morale erodes not because of fear, but because of predictability. The pattern is clear, and it does not favor survival. Prisoners taken after the collapse are different from those taken before it. They ask fewer questions. They argue less. Many already know where they are headed. Some carry folded surrender papers written in advance. The belief that the war might still turn has faded into routine acceptance. On the Allied side, the action barely registers beyond unit level. There are no medals awarded immediately, no press coverage. The advance continues because it must. Commanders note the effectiveness of rapid exploitation, of trusting junior leaders to act without hesitation when opportunities appear. The sergeant submits his after-action report. It is concise: times, coordinates, movements, no commentary on prisoners, no mention of smiles or assumptions. The language is technical, professional, and entirely unremarkable. Yet within that report is evidence of something larger. The war is no longer decided by grand maneuvers alone. It is shaped by dozens of moments like this, where initiative at the lowest level transforms local success into operational momentum. As Allied columns push forward, crossing rivers and entering towns whose names will soon appear on maps printed for victory, the consequences of these small decisions compound, and the space between German expectation and Allied reality grows wider with every mile. In the weeks that follow, the front does not stabilize again. German forces fall back toward the Rhine, abandoning positions once described as defensible at all costs. The language of command shifts. Orders emphasize delay, not victory, survival, not counterattack. The war has entered its final arithmetic. The collapse of localized defenses, like the one that unraveled in this sector, forces higher command into constant improvisation. Units are reassigned mid-march. Volkssturm formations are rushed forward with minimal training. Boys and older men now occupy positions once held by seasoned soldiers. The contrast is stark. On the Allied side, momentum becomes doctrine. What junior leaders demonstrate in moments like this is institutionalized. Exploitation replaces caution. Speed becomes protection. The idea that waiting for perfect information is more dangerous than acting on partial certainty spreads upward through the chain of command. This shift matters. By March 1945, Allied forces cross the Rhine in multiple places. The German heartland is no longer shielded by natural barriers or prepared lines. Cities fall in days instead of weeks. Resistance continues, but it is fragmented, disconnected, and increasingly symbolic. The prisoners from that frozen road are processed, transported, and dispersed into camps. Their war ends not with a final battle, but with a quiet realization that the structure they trusted no longer exists. Some will survive captivity and return home. Others will not. None will forget the moment they understood the balance had truly shifted. The young sergeant moves on. He leads again. He gives more orders. Some result in success, others in loss. His youth remains visible, but it no longer defines him. Like thousands of others, he carries the weight of decisions that altered lives without ever being recorded in headlines. History will remember the war in broad strokes: invasions, offensives, surrenders. It will not remember the road, or the smiles, or the quiet confidence that dissolved in the face of reality. Yet without such moments, the war's conclusion would not have arrived as it did, through accumulation rather than spectacle. And as the guns move east and the calendar edges closer to May, the meaning of authority, experience, and power has been permanently rewritten by the war itself. Wars are often remembered through their loudest moments: the landings, the bombardments, the signatures on surrender documents. History favors scale, clarity, and finality. But wars are not won only in those moments. They are decided in fragments, through decisions made by individuals whose names rarely appear in books. This moment was one of those fragments. A young sergeant standing on a frozen road did not change the course of the war by himself. He did not intend to. He simply acted within a system that had learned how to trust judgment over hierarchy, speed over ritual, adaptation over tradition. The German soldiers who smiled at him were not foolish. They were operating within a worldview that had once worked and no longer did. That is how power shifts in war. Not with announcements, but with miscalculations. Not with dramatic reversals, but with the slow realization that familiar rules no longer apply. The German defense did not fail because it lacked courage. It failed because it could not move fast enough in a war that no longer waited. The sergeant's orders mattered because they reflected a deeper truth of the conflict's final months. Experience had been compressed, authority redistributed, and outcomes shaped by those closest to the ground. Youth had become a consequence of survival, not a liability. When the war ended, millions would return home carrying memories of moments like this: small, quiet, decisive. Moments when assumptions dissolved and certainty failed. History would move on. But on that road, for those who stood there, the war revealed something lasting: that in its final phase, World War II was not only a clash of nations, but a test of which systems could learn faster than they broke. And in that test, the answer had already been given, long before the last shot was fired.